Coming up on the Threat Status podcast, we talk to Norman Roule, a former longtime U.S. intelligence official and an advisor to the group United Against Nuclear Iran. And we dive into the complex relationships between China, Russia, and North Korea, and examine how Elon Musk's Starlink system has forever changed the nature of warfare. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, national security editor here at the Times. A lot to get through this week again, and we've got a great interview coming up. But first things first, as always, Guy, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. So great to be here as always. There are a few things that actually went under the radar over the past week that really caught my eye. The first was the little reported visit by a high-level Chinese Communist Party delegation to North Korea. Beijing sent Zhao Leji, a member of the tiny CCP political bureau, essentially the highest-ranking CCP organ in the Chinese government, on what Chinese state media described as a, quote, goodwill visit, end quote, to North Korea. Leji is actually the highest-ranking Chinese official to visit North Korea in 5 years, since Chinese President Xi Jinping made a trip in 2019, shoring up the North Korea-China alliance at the time in the wake of what was then President Trump's failed denuclearization summits with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. This caught me this week because it comes at a really important moment of deepening ties between North Korea and Russia. Remember, North Korea is providing Russia with weaponry for the Russian war in Ukraine in exchange for Russian shipments of food to North Korea and raw materials for weapons manufacturing. The two have grown closer in recent years, and it looks like the China visit to North Korea now was a clear signal that Beijing is worried about having Kim Jong-un pulled out of China's orbit by Russia. Russia and China have a long history of jockeying for influence over North Korea. It's important to note that while North Korea originally had a mutual defense treaty with the Soviet Union decades ago, Pyongyang never re-upped the treaty with Moscow after the fall of the Soviet bloc. However, the North Koreans did re-up a mutual defense treaty with China back in the early 1990s, and they continue to keep it in place to the current realm. North Korea is actually China's only formal military ally. So there's some great power dynamics going on there that intersect with U.S. national security in a couple of ways. First, China's visit with its treaty ally was curiously timed to coincide with the state visit to Washington by Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and a visit to the U.S. last week by President Bongbong Marcos. The U.S. has military treaty alliances with both Japan and the Philippines, and the thrust of last week's visits in Washington was really the Biden administration's effort to shore up those alliances and alliances with other democracies in East Asia in the face of China's increasingly aggressive military posturing toward those democracies. It appears as if China wanted to seize the moment last week by going to North Korea to show off that it too has a military ally in the region, a nuclear-armed one at that, in North Korea. But there's another point about timing here that I think also got missed, which is that Zhao Leji's visit also came as South Korea, another country right on China's periphery that the U.S. has a close military alliance with. South Korea was holding a major midterm election last week. Left-leaning parties, widely seen to be more conciliatory to North Korea and China, they came out victorious, dealing a blow to South Korea's conservative president, Yoon Suk-yeol, who's really had a notably confrontational posture toward China and North Korea in recent years. So China likely wanted to capitalize on the optics of that loss for Yoon Suk-yeol in South Korea. But again here, why does it all matter for U.S. national security? Remember, the U.S. has about 50,000 troops in Japan, 30,000 in South Korea, and is right now talking about long-term stationing troops in the Philippines for the first time in decades. all of these alliances and troops are seen to be crucial as the U.S. pushes to prevent the Chinese military from potentially taking over the island democracy of Taiwan, a place that produces more high-level microchips than anywhere else in the world. I digress on this, but I thought it was noteworthy and didn't get a lot of coverage in the U.S. media.
Well, one thing that's interesting to me about this guy, just from the personal perspective of Kim Jong-un, I mean, this is a guy I'm sure he probably loves essentially feeling like he's got China and Russia competing for his affections right now. This is a guy that we know loves the spotlight. Donald Trump, of course, famously used that to the U.S. advantage with those face-to-face meetings he had with Kim. So I would imagine Kim is loving feeling that he's got two nations essentially, competing right now for him. And speaking of Russia, fascinating story in the Wall Street Journal that I'd like to talk about briefly. It seems like Russia, in some ways, has turned the tables on Ukraine with Elon Musk's Starlink internet terminal system. We talked about Starlink before here on the show and how critical Starlink was to helping maintain internet access in Ukraine, which in turn allowed the Ukrainian military to target Russian forces. And as I've written before, Guy, it's entirely plausible Kyiv might have fallen to the Russian army without Starlink. Now that the Wall Street Journal has information about how Starlink is essentially being sold through, quote, a shadowy supply chain and eventually ending up in the hands of the Russian military. There seems to be a black market essentially at work here, which is pretty fascinating in and of itself, because in the 21st century, black market weapons aren't just guns and grenade launchers, but now we're going to internet terminals, satellites, things like that. Here's where it gets interesting. Can Elon Musk just shut off those Starlink terminals that Russia is using? Presumably so. The Wall Street Journal story has a subheadline that says, quote, SpaceX hasn't shut them off. SpaceX, of course, is Musk's company. The U.S. military wants SpaceX to shut down Russia's access, but apparently we can't make them. John Plum, the Assistant Defense Secretary for Space Policy, said at an event last week that, quote, I don't think DOD is in a position to make them do these things. I'll just say that. I'm aware of Ukraine's concerns. We're working through it with both Ukraine and Starlink. So this is a dynamic guy that I'm not really sure we've seen. Assistant Secretary Plum described SpaceX as a great partner. It's clear they've done a lot of good for Ukraine, but this is a lot of power for a company to have. The trajectory of this war would be entirely different were it not for Starlink. So is that a good thing, you think, Guy? How do we navigate this new dynamic?
And it's maddening, Ben. Yeah, you're talking about the intersection between private ownership of sensitive technology that
can impact a war directly. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see also as we go into the coming election how Elon Musk postures himself toward Biden and toward Trump. Remember when Trump was elected in 2016, there was suddenly footage of Elon Musk going to meet with Trump. It looked like they were going to come together. All of the narrative at the time was about electric vehicles and, could Elon Musk somehow convince Trump to take climate change seriously? Musk, this, kind of like Thomas Edison type character mixed with Steve Jobs, who's like at the forefront in today's world where you have this increasingly complex global geopolitical situation with technology. So it is totally interesting, and we're going to keep watching. And I do actually, Ben, one other thing on Russia and Ukraine. There's another development that caught my eye this week, and that was how Serbian President Alexander Vučić showed up in Paris for a meeting with French President Macron, and Vučić announced that Serbia is close to a deal to buy fighter jets from France. This was noteworthy because if it actually comes to the fore, it would represent a major shift for Serbia away from its longtime tradition of buying weapons produced and supplied by Russia. Serbia is not a member of NATO, and it has this close relationship with Russia. That's meant that Belgrade has refused to join international sanctions against Moscow over Ukraine. The U.S. and European nations have been voicing concern recently about the Serbia-Russia relationship, and some in the region have warned that Russia may be trying to actually foment a new Balkan war to try and distract the West from Ukraine. So the Vučić announcement about potentially buying fighter jets from France is actually very interesting.
And France, of course, is positioning itself in a different way here with respect to the Russia-Ukraine war. I had a story last week in the Washington Times that looked at Macron essentially putting on the table NATO or EU troops in Ukraine, something that the US, Germany have essentially ruled out. But Macron has refused to back away from that position. And analysts that I talk to say that is a deliberate move on his part, that he senses there might be some weakness on the part of the Biden administration and the US policy, and he wants to position himself, strange as it may seem, France as a strong leader in this time of war in Eastern Europe. So it's certainly something worth keeping an eye on.
Especially when you think about how politicized foreign policy politics are becoming right now in the U.S. election cycle. It's really important, I think, to follow what the Europeans are doing, what the EU is doing, and recognize, well, that there might be ideological disagreements with the individual U.S. parties. Republicans might feel this way, Democrats might feel that way. At the end of the day, the EU is and NATO, these are the major transatlantic partners to the United States, and we got to be paying attention to what the little developments are. Ben, let's try to get here to our featured guest of the week. I know he's waiting. Norman Roule, to discuss threats and other dynamics relating to Iran. Norm is currently a non-resident senior advisor with the Transatlantic Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies think tank. He previously served for 34 years in the Central Intelligence Agency, managing significant programs relating to the Middle East, and he served as the National Intelligence Manager for Iran, the NIM-1, as it's known in the intelligence community, at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence from 2008 to 2017, interestingly spanning the period between Barack Obama and Donald Trump.
That's right. And Norm, of course, has some great insights into the Israel-Iran tensions and the Middle East as a whole. But his interview here on Threat Status was recorded before last Saturday's Iranian drone and missile attack against Israel. Now, that attack, of course, was direct retaliation, according to Iran, for the April 1st strike on Tehran's embassy complex in Syria. Israel is widely believed to be responsible for that strike that killed top Iranian military officials, though the Netanyahu government in Israel hasn't publicly addressed it. Now, the vast majority, Israel says about 99% of the missiles and drones fired at Israel by Iran were shot down by Israeli defense forces and U.S. military assets in the region. And both the U.S. and Israel hailed this as a huge success. The regime in Tehran now says the matter's closed, and from their perspective, it's time to move on. But look, Guy, I get the sense that Israel feels very differently here. Just from a purely historical perspective, this is a huge deal. This is the first time Iran, the country of Iran, not its proxies, has attacked Israel directly. It's hard for me to imagine a scenario where the Netanyahu government doesn't retaliate in some way. And so to say that we are headed into uncharted waters here would be an understatement. But for now, let's get to our big picture conversation with Norm Roule.
Norm, welcome to Threat Status. Thank you so much for coming on with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let's jump right into this. Is Iran benefiting and capitalizing on the Gaza war in terms of exploiting the situation to strengthen its proxy relationships with militants regionally? I'm going to assume that your answer is probably yes, but I'd like to hear you explain it. And if it is yes, what is really the Iranian goal vis-a-vis bigger regional geopolitics relating to the U.S., Saudi Arabia, Israel, Iraq, Turkey?
Well, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, but let me unpack that. Because the Gaza war gives Iran multiple benefits. It allows it to demonstrate that it's standing with a proxy in a fight against the United States and against Israel. It allows it to show that its proxies can grind away at Israel and that the world will stand with its proxies, as we've seen in some of the outrageous demonstrations supporting the terrorist organization that is Hamas. It has also allowed Iran to escape any punishment for its activities in the region. And its activities not only in the Gaza war, but also in Yemen, where it has now touched global commerce, and in Iraq, where it has touched U.S. lives. And Iran has paid no price for this. But most recently, as we've looked at the increase in tensions and the sense that Iran will be striking back against Israel for the reported Israeli strike on the Damascus embassy, you've seen a number of world foreign ministers call Iran and ask Iran to restrain itself. So Iran is now receiving phone calls from multiple world actors asking it to, in essence, behave, but also that gives Iran a chance to be at a big table and to push its own equities in those environments. The Biden administration, injudiciously, in my view, has given a visa to the Iranian foreign minister to travel to the United States, and that gives them a world forum to push their extremist anti-American view. Now, if you're Putin, if you're Xi, if you're the North Koreans, so you look at this, you say, these people got away with it and paid no price. I can get away with it too. I think we should think about what this means.
Norm, speaking of Iranian proxies, there was a lot of fear, especially early on in the Israel-Hamas war, that a second front could open with Hezbollah to the north in Lebanon. Why hasn't that happened yet, in your view? Is Hezbollah waiting for something, or is there another reason why that second front hasn't fully opened yet?
Well, I confess I never had that and don't have that to this point, at least, significant concern for a couple of reasons. If you look at all of the actors in the region, none of them want to undertake an activity that would ignite a conventional conflict, because that conflict would inherently destroy their economic and political domestic ambitions. So a war between Hezbollah and Israel could have catastrophic consequences for Lebanese Hezbollah and Lebanon itself with no certain outcome. I mean, other than I'm standing with Hamas, what does Nasrallah get from such a conflict? Now, at the same time, there are multiple incentives for Iran and its proxies to continue the current rate of violence, although I think the periodicity, the intensity, the weapons, and the geography of those attacks will vary based on capability, timing, a variety of different issues. But where I think we should worry is that all of the weapons that Iran is now using, with no international pushback, are of weapons of mass destruction. These are missiles. These are drones. These are underwater armed vehicles aimed at ships that are capable of significant damage and cost to human life. And I think this draws me to my last concern and explains a bit of Damascus and where we are today, that because of these actions, because of the impact of these weapons, you get a sense of a catastrophic success, which sort of draws in behaviors that didn't exist before. So Hezbollah has now pushed about 80,000 Israelis from their homes. And this doesn't get a lot of coverage in the US press. Likewise, about 120,000 Lebanese have had to move from their homes on the Lebanese side of the border, again because of Lebanese Hezbollah Iran activities. Gets no coverage in the broader media. And I thank you for raising it. At the same time, Hezbollah is able to conduct multiple operations against Israel, and it keeps it at a level where it shows skin in the game, but doesn't risk a war per se. At some point, the Netanyahu government or successor government will have to deal with the idea of how do you get these people back home, the 80,000 there. I don't think diplomacy is going to solve this. I think it's going to be some sort of increased military action.
You've brought up that level of where are the red lines of escalation and how Hezbollah seems to operate just beneath them with its strikes into northern Israel. You then mentioned a couple of times, you've been talking about the April 1 strike, the reported Israeli airstrike that took out the consular section of the Iranian embassy in Damascus, which was an indication that Israel also is really trying to figure out where those red lines. Maybe Mossad knows exactly where that red line is or thinks it is. But I want to ask you about the April 1 strike and the extent to which it has escalated regional tensions. Has it derailed U.S. efforts to get a ceasefire in Gaza? CIA Director William Burns has been doing another round of shuttle diplomacy in recent weeks, trying to get Hamas and the Netanyahu government on the same page and get a ceasefire. And here's another question. Would the Israelis have given a heads up to the U.S.? And there's a lot of talk in the Arab media and the Iranian media suggesting that the U.S. completely was in cahoots and signed off on the target.
It is extraordinarily unlikely that Israel provided significant advance notice of this activity to the United States. Concerns ranging from leaks, putting the U.S. in a political position where it might have some sense of culpability. America's support was not needed for this activity. There are no Americans on the spot. And by providing perhaps an hour's notice. I'm guessing at this minutes notice. It allows the United States to undertake already very carefully planned, structured, and routinely exercised force protection procedures to protect our personnel in the region as this rolls out. So I want to put that in a box. To your first question on the issue of what the Damascus operation has done to the ceasefire, I think these are two very separate things. I have never seen evidence that Hamas is significantly interested in a ceasefire. It's interested in grinding away at U.S. Israeli influence in the region. It's willing to spill the blood of thousands of Palestinians as it does so. And a ceasefire does not contribute to those two capacities that shows you Israelis as being against humanitarian actions and hurting the United States. I don't think would really do much for Hamas unless they felt that they were really at the end and they needed this for survival. So I think Hamas's actions would have proceeded as they've gone to date. The Damascus event opens up the potential for another layer or another arena of activity in the region, but Hamas will continue to perform as it has performed to date.
Norm, I want to ask about the Houthis, and I know this is kind of an elementary question, but I think it's an important one. What are both the long-term and short-term impacts of the Houthi attacks on global shipping? And has the U.S. and the coalition it's tried to put together, have they done enough to strike back on the Houthis and try to prevent these attacks on global shipping?
The consequences of the Houthi operation will likely be seen by future historians as the most important and far-reaching of these terrible 6 months. Iran's proxies initially were people who would use a toggle switch on a car to explode a car bomb at an embassy. And then they were to undertake operations against U.S. personnel in Iraq or terrorist operations abroad, very small level operations. And then they moved to state building operations with proxies. Now what we've seen is they are touching the global economy. There are no LNG ships going into the Red Sea. That is a financial and energy issue, but there's also humanitarian aid to millions of Sudanese that has been interrupted by this, and that's a catastrophic humanitarian issue. It has weakened the Egyptian economy, costing them hundreds of millions, at this point likely billions of dollars of revenue. This is a dramatic consequence that reaches out to car factories in Europe, as well as energy supplies throughout the world. And this is something that Iran and the Houthis now have in their pocket whenever they want to do it. So if this conflict ends tomorrow, Iran, unless we do something dramatically different, will simply replenish their weapons, provide them with any other guidance, skills, training to get around whatever they saw us do in the recent months, and then wait to use this again to damage the world economy. And you should think about what that means to other adversaries in the world. Will the Chinese choose to respond similarly in the Malacca Straits, the West Philippine Sea? If our only response is to defend and degrade, but not to deter, well, what does that do if you're the Chinese firing a lot more impressive weaponry against adversaries than the Houthis? I really think the ripples from the Red Sea issue have not yet touched the shores we need to think about.
What could deterrence look like? I mean, short of of ground troops going into Yemen, which it doesn't seem like a realistic possibility, at least right now. Are there more steps that can be done short of that?
I don't believe ground troops are the answer. I certainly do think that increasing the amount of resources to interdicting Iranian weaponry is useful, but we need to keep in mind that that's not deterrence either. Deterrence has multiple steps on the ladder. You do public-private warnings, you defend yourself, you attack facilities and structures on the ground that contain weaponry, and then you attack personnel responsible for the decisions to kill people, to kill innocent mariners. And we need to remember, Vietnamese and Bangladeshi seafarers have died in this affair. We haven't reached that point, but I would have liked to have seen earlier on a multilateral effort where in essence we went in and spent several weeks destroying every missile facility, UAV manufacturing facility, mine facility, the explosive boats the Houthis used, and in essence, a more aggressive campaign of taking that out preemptively. Once we saw that they were using them and had ignored the warnings, diplomacy, et cetera, because at this point, certainly we're degrading their capacity, but you should keep in mind, this is not cost-free also. Our missiles cost millions of dollars. It is likely that we have spent north of $500 million, closer to $1 billion in that operation, off budget. We're not learning much about Iranian technology. Those are fairly simple systems. But the Chinese, Russians, and others who are watching us perform with our allies in the region, which hasn't been the best of performance in some cases, because of coalition tensions, are learning things that they can do in other arenas. So I think a lot more time needs to be spent on the Red Sea problem.
Before I get to the last question here, you and I have discussed, and I've reported on it in the Threat Status Daily newsletter and in the Washington Times, the evidence that there's a presence of Chinese anti-ship missile technology that's been fired and used by the Houthis, and there's this debate about how exactly did the Houthis get it. I want to ask this broader question about, is the Iran, Russia, China, North Korea axis of evil or axis of tyrannies being overstated by misinformed or overexcited U.S. hawks? It's always in someone's benefit in Washington to play up America's enemies or play up the global threat. In your mind, is that being overstated? Because that's becoming an increasingly popular narrative, not just among conservatives or hawks. I'm hearing it talked about at think tanks all over Washington.
So it was an important issue that you raised. I want to go on record and say that I am an ardent advocate of diplomacy and engagement, even with adversaries, to avoid conflict. And only employing military force or kinetic action when adversaries continue to take steps that threaten the lives and the national security interests of the United States. This said, as we look at this issue, I think the way you may want to consider this access that is building, it's almost like a salami that's being built in reverse. So you see a tiny slice added to it, and policymakers say, there may have been an exchange of military capacity. Do we go to war over that? No, we don't. Okay, we see that a Chinese provided drones in Africa look like Iranian drones. How did the Chinese get that technology? Well, we're not going to do anything about that. And you likewise see Chinese or Russian military technology going to Iran. And in each case, you've got this structure, this thing that is built over time, and suddenly you've got a major problem on your hands because you haven't actually taken the steps to address it when it was smaller. And frankly, there are those sometimes in the policy world, those who say, well, we might have been able to do something about it earlier, but now it's too late, it's too hard, it's too costly. We have to accept facts on the ground, the world as it is, and move on. And the adversaries love that. In fact, if I can just go on for one more minute, one of the things that you note in common with China, Russia, and Iran is almost an island-like threat picture. Now, this is easy to understand when you look at Chinese island buildings in the Pacific, but I want you to think of Iranian proxies as islands of influence and power. I want you to think about Russia and Africa through the Wagner Group and its Ministry of Defense, with a number of very anti-American governments that have significant resource potential. Think about how that all fits together. In each case, it's a reverse salami slice that's building a terrible threat for U.S. and partner national security interests.
Norm, thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status podcast. I hope we can get you back in the months ahead.
Thank you. I wish you luck. This is a great podcast. I'm a listener. Everyone else should be as well.
And it's now time for Threat of the Week. This is a weekly segment where Guy and I each choose a threat, whether it's here domestically at home or some corner of the world that we think is threatening U.S. national security and threatening you, the listeners, the American public right now. And turning back to Ukraine just briefly, Guy, my threat is attrition and specifically how it might ultimately be the undoing of Ukraine and its war with Russia. Let's take stock quickly of Russian losses. Ukraine claims that Russia has suffered a whopping 450,000 casualties since the start of the war in February 2022. Those figures are probably high, of course, since they're coming from Ukraine, but U.S. officials have said Russian losses are in the hundreds of thousands. U.S. military officials said last week that Russia's lost roughly 10% of its air fleet. They've had plenty of drones shot down, even a few ships destroyed. And yet, U.S. officials also said last week that Kyiv could lose without further U.S. assistance. And the reason for that is that the Russian military has essentially gotten back to the point where it was before the war. Deputy Secretary of State Kirk Campbell 2 weeks ago said, quote, "We have assessed over the course of the last couple of months that Russia has almost completely reconstituted militarily." On the other hand, Guy, you highlighted in threat status last week a new push in Ukraine to boost conscription. That Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, said he wants to mobilize 500,000 fresh troops. For context, the population of Ukraine is about 38 million. The population of Russia is 144 million. It goes without saying, throughout history, we've seen Russia's willingness to throw waves of bodies into a conflict. So Ukraine just isn't able to do that as well. Its military is not as big, its economy is not as robust, and it's heavily reliant on foreign aid. So right now, Guy, attrition's a threat because the longer this war drags on, at least the way it looks right now, the better it is for Vladimir Putin.
Interesting, Ben. I'm actually going to go again to my regular stomping grounds for my thread of the week, the intersection between artificial intelligence and national security. And in this case, the threat that authoritarian, autocratic adversaries are leading the charge in creating AI applications that are potentially very dangerous and could dramatically reshape how governments impose social controls over humans. Typically, the discussion over authoritarian uses of AI center on China, but this week I want to point to a recent analysis by a group of Estonian journalists of leaked Kremlin documents indicating that the Russian government is currently deploying an artificial intelligence-powered surveillance operation using facial recognition to identify opposition figures. Aspects of the new system were reportedly used recently to assist in the arrest of people attending the late opposition leader Alexei Navalny's funeral. And the leaked documents show Russian President Vladimir Putin's administration intends to spend more than $121 million on the AI system's continued development over the next 2 years. This sharply contrasts with the European Union, which recently passed and is soon to implement new multinational laws that ban real-time facial recognition in public and bar surveillance agencies and law enforcement from using AI for so-called scraping of facial images. The Russia developments also come as the U.S. debates AI, facial recognition, and the intersection of those things with federal law enforcement. President Biden pushed through an executive order this year that asked for federal agencies to review how they're using AI in the criminal justice system, but the order fails way short of the kind of ban the EU is putting in place. So my thread of the week is that authoritarian governments like Russia and China will have more influence than the democratic world over how facial recognition AI tools get used for surveillance going forward and how those tools proliferate through the world over the coming years.
The speed at which this is moving, AI and its implementation around the world is just fascinating. And it's something we're going to be on top of course, every week here at the Threat Status Podcast. So, Guy, thank you so much for joining me this week. Thank you all for listening. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Thanks to Norman Roule for joining us. We'll be back next week with the Threat Status Podcast.